The lost golden city of Aten. You step over cracked mud brick and into streets that have not seen footsteps for 3,000 years. Walls rising to about 9 feet with doorways wide enough for crowds. Broken pottery, scarab amulets, and the bones of long-cooled ovens tell a simple truth. This was not a tiny workers' camp. This was a planned city with neighborhoods, workshops, and places where official records were kept. Archaeologists found rows of bakeries with ovens and storage jars. They found jewelry and seal impressions stamped with a royal name. One sealed vessel carried 10 kilograms of preserved meat labeled for a royal festival. Those labels are not gossip. They are administrative records, written where everyone could see them. And they link the city to the palace of a pharaoh who spent on a scale that rewrites common ideas about ancient wealth. For years, some modern voices argued that great monuments rose from a handful of elite patrons and a loose labor force, a neat story that suited private shows and exhibition sponsorship. The city argues otherwise. The scale of industry here shows organized logistics and state control over food, craft, and labor. That undermines any tidy narrative that tries to make the past look small and manageable for private branding. Inside one house, an imprint on a clay seal changed how historians read the site. The stamp carried the royal cartouche and the name of an official charged with supply. That is a small object with a loud voice. It tells us this was not loose charity. It was an organized system supplying festivals and projects on a massive scale. Think about a royal production line. Bakers measured out grain in standardized jars. Craftsmen worked in workshops that produced jewelry with consistent styles. Paper-thin accounting surfaces survive in the form of pottery marks and sealings. Those marks are the bookkeeping of a state, not the touch of private collectors making a neat story for a museum donation. Some modern narratives, often promoted through flashy exhibits and funded programs, like to frame ancient labor as sentimental and small-scale. The objects here do not fit that frame. They point toward centralized control, redistributive systems, and logistics that required oversight from the palace. That reality undercuts any story that treats monumental building as the hobby of a solitary patron. Bronze Age tombs in Cyprus. You step into a low chamber that has been sealed for 3,000 years. The air is dust-dry, and the floor is a mosaic of broken gold and ceramic. Gold diadems lie beside carved ivory and beads of blue stone, so pure it had to travel from far beyond these coasts. Archaeologists opened 2 tombs near Hala Sultan Tekke and pulled out over 500 artifacts. There were ceramic pieces from the Aegean world, high-quality Mycenaean pottery that once rode on trading ships. There was faience and ivory from Egypt. Amber from the Baltic and blue lapis lazuli from Afghanistan sat next to red carnelian that came from India. Those are not casual souvenirs. They map a trade network that spans the known world of the time. The goods tell a story that some modern exhibitors and sponsors like to simplify. Instead of a handful of local chiefs trading locally, these tombs show elites who controlled copper and directed goods across the Mediterranean and beyond. Control of Troodos. Copper created real wealth. That wealth bought exotic materials and crafted a global style that proves connections people sometimes deny in tidy PR narratives. When a wealthy institution or donor frames the past as smaller or purer, these objects speak against that frame. The presence of amber and lapis makes it impossible to pretend these elites were isolated or simple. These tombs force a different conclusion. They show concentrated power, far-reaching trade, and deliberate accumulation of status goods. Those imports expose a modern falsehood. Some polished exhibits and big donors like to sell a story of simple local life and humble trade. The objects in these tombs refuse that story. Take lapis lazuli. It did not arrive by accident. It came from a long journey from Afghanistan, across many hands and many ships. Amber traveled from the Baltic. Carnelian came from as far as India. Those stones mark roots and relationships. They mark deliberate exchange networks managed by people who controlled production and transport. Control of Troodos copper meant control of bronze. That control was wealth in motion. Copper paid for exotic goods. Copper bought alliances. It underwrote the ability to commission gold diadems, and to bury elites with style meant to be seen for centuries. This is not romantic craft. This is organized extraction and concentrated profit. When a wealthy backer or a headline wants to make the past feel intimate and tidy, these tombs push back. The objects in the ground do not care for glossy narratives. They show scale, reach, and intentionality. The Terracotta Army. A farmer in 1974 tossed a shovel into the earth and found a broken clay face staring back. That accidental moment opened pits filled with soldiers, thousands of life-sized figures, horses and chariots, a whole army frozen in clay. Archaeologists soon saw something unexpected. These were not identical mass casts. Workshops made parts. Heads, arms, torsos were shaped separately and then assembled. Artisans added details after assembly, so each face looked different. That tells us something important. It means organized production with specialization. It means planning, standard parts, and quality control on a vast scale. Construction of the mausoleum began in 246 BCE and continued for decades. Building it required hundreds of thousands of workers drawn from regional labor pools. They quarried clay, fired kilns, carved molds, and painted surfaces. The project moved resources and people like a state logistics machine, not a private hobby. For modern audiences, some funders and high-profile exhibits prefer a gentler story. They highlight individual genius and human craftsmanship while downplaying the political engine that made the work possible. The terracotta finds refuse that gentle framing. The army shows the raw power of imperial organization and the scale of resources commanded by a ruler. Paint on clay told part of the story. Many figures were once bright. Traces of pigment and lacquer remained beneath the dust. Pigments like cinnabar and mineral blues needed skilled preparation and costly materials. Lacquer required plant resins and controlled kiln work. That level of finishing shows the state was investing not just in numbers, but in spectacle. Archaeologists also found clear workshop marks. Tool marks line up. Molds and kiln waste cluster in production zones. Some faces share identical undercuts and assembly joints. That is manufacturing logic. It shows specialization and dedicated production centers working at scale. It is not the work of casual tribute or small-scale charity. There is another piece most people miss. The logistics involved food, shelter, and supply chains for the workforce. Roads and provisioning networks had to move clay, timber, and fuel for kilns. That infrastructure required planning from the top. You do not get hundreds of thousands of workers and painted armies without a political apparatus to organize them. This is organized power in plain sight. Modern presentations that turn such projects into sentimental stories about communal pride miss the record. They flatten coercion into charm. The terracotta figures refuse that flattening. They are evidence of resource control, of a state that could call labor and materials into being for an image of immortality. Movile Cave. You squeeze through a narrow opening, and the air hits like warm metal. It tastes faintly of sulfur. The light dies fast, and the cave lives by a different rule. No sun reaches these pools. No green plants stand here. Life runs on chemistry. The cave has been sealed for 5.5 million years. Its air holds low oxygen, about 7 to 10%. It carries hydrogen sulfide and methane in surprising amounts. At the base of the food web are bacteria that eat those gases. They turn poison into food. Chemosynthesis replaces photosynthesis. Tiny microbes build the first rung of a web that supports spiders, crustaceans, and blind insects found nowhere else on Earth. Scientists counted 57 animal species in the cave, and then another shock. 37 of them are endemic. That means they evolved here and only here. Many show the usual cave traits. They are pale or blind. They move slowly. They adapted to a very narrow chemistry. Disturb that chemistry, and the whole chain can collapse. This is where the discovery pushes back on a common modern line. Some powerful voices and well-funded projects like to argue that nature will adapt to industrial change. They present adaptability as an excuse for rapid exploitation. Movile Cave tells a different story. It shows adaptation can create fragile specialisms that do not survive broad disruption. The cave air holds low oxygen. It sits around 7 to 10%. Carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide are high. That chemistry is stable only in a sealed system. Change the chemistry and species adapted to it cannot simply move or switch diets. They die. Researchers measured microbial mats, traced food webs, and tested how tiny shifts in gas concentrations cause collapses in the chain. The evidence is clear. This is a fragile, highly specialized system that took millions of years to evolve. It is not a place that bounces back like a garden. That matters because some high-profile projects funded by wealthy interests sell the idea that nature will adapt quickly to development. They call it resilience. Movile Cave is a living refutation. It shows specialization creates vulnerability. It shows that claiming minimal harm is not neutral science. It is a bet on which species we are willing to lose for profit. So the real question becomes practical and urgent. When money says everything will be fine, who decides which ecosystems are expendable and which must be protected? The ground here keeps an answer written in microbes and blind insects. Derinkuyu Underground City. You duck into a narrow throat of rock, and the world closes above you. A cool draft moves through shafts that reach deep into the earth. The passage narrows, opens into rooms, then into communal halls carved in soft volcanic stone. The complex plunges down roughly 85 meters. It spreads on multiple levels. There are sleeping quarters, storage rooms filled with niches for jars, stables for animals, and a deep well over 55 meters that provided water no matter what was happening above. More than 50 ventilation shafts pull fresh air into the depths. Those shafts are not decorative. They are engineering. People did not hide here for a night. They lived, worked, worshipped, and taught. There are areas that look like classrooms. There are spaces small enough to slow invaders and wide enough to shelter entire families. The corridors include deliberate choke points and rolling stone doors that seal an entrance. Every feature shows planning and long-term use. For years, some modern promoters and high-profile development campaigns sold the land as empty or lightly used. They turned fragile histories into neat tourist scripts that fit sponsorship packages. The underground city refuses those tidy labels. The scale of the design shows intentional urban planning. The city could shelter as many as 20,000 people in a crisis. That is not temporary camping. That is organized community infrastructure. There it is. Small tally marks scratched into the plaster above a row of storage niches. Archaeologists dusted the shelves and found organized jars stacked by size and by mark. The marks are simple. Lines and notches that match across dozens of jar handles. They are not graffiti. They are inventory. They show who stored what and how much had been moved in or out. Near those jars, researchers found clamps and wedges shaped to hold wooden shelving. They found wear patterns on floors where carts passed. They found traces of food residues in sealed niches. All of that adds up to bookkeeping, logistics, and deliberate allocation. This is not random hoarding. This is administration. Those tally marks name roles, even if they do not name people. They show supervisors and storekeepers managed resources. They show a social system capable of provisioning thousands for long periods. That undermines any tidy modern pitch that the region was an uninhabited blank, ready for development. When developers or high-profile backers present the land as empty or underused, it is useful to ask one question: empty for whom? These marks answer that question. They show communities that maintained infrastructure, assigned duties, and protected supplies. They show civic organization. The underground city is not a curious novelty. It is a record of how people lived together, how they planned for danger, and how they assigned responsibility. That reality resists being turned into a marketing line. Luxor obelisk inscriptions. You are standing in Place de la Concorde looking up at a needle of stone that came from Luxor 3 centuries ago. During restoration work, a researcher climbed to the gilded tip and found something few people had ever seen: hidden marks. Short lines of hieroglyphs placed where only a few elite could read them. Jean-Guillaume Aulet-Pelletier noticed 7 inscriptions near the apex. They run in a rare horizontal layout, designed to be read by people arriving at the temple from the river. That matters. The messages were not for the passing crowd. They were for aristocrats who approached by boat during the Opet festival. One carving shows Ramses wearing the double crown and an offering table. Another mixes bull horns and crown imagery, with a phrase that scholars translate as, "appease the life force of the god Amun." Those are not neutral notes, they are instructions. They tell viewers to perform rituals that reinforce the pharaoh as divinely sanctioned. The layout and angle are clever. Place matters. The messages use 3-dimensional placement to control who reads them and when. That is propaganda by design. The obelisk was a tool to shape elite belief and to direct ritual action that kept power in place. Some modern exhibitions and wealthy backers prefer a tidy, patriotic version of monuments. They avoid the messy parts about power and ritual because audiences like simpler stories. These hidden inscriptions refuse that tidy edit. They show that monuments did political work for rulers, and that viewing was often restricted and staged. Those inscriptions were not accidental extras. They were a performance cue. Aristocrats, arriving by boat during the Opet festival, would look up at the obelisk, and the glaze of position and angle made the message readable at a moment of ritual flow. The pharaoh did not simply record triumph, he scripted how an elite audience should act. Read closely, and you see purpose. The offering table image tells the viewer to enact generosity. The bull horn motif and crown link, Ramses to divine strength. Together, the symbols direct behavior. They tell nobles to offer, to honor Amun, to renew the ruler's sacred role. That is propaganda in its oldest form. It uses stone, sightlines, and ceremony to shape belief. Now look at how the story changes when someone rewrites the past for a sponsor. Museums and glossy exhibits often highlight the obelisk as an exotic gift and a marvel of engineering. They emphasize travel and diplomacy. They rarely emphasize staged elite ritual or the pharaoh asking for public obedience. That edit matters. It moves power from being active then to being tasteful now. Who benefits from that edit? Sponsors, donors, and tourism operators. They prefer a monument that flatters national pride or sells romance. Political questions about who used the object to command loyalty make audiences uncomfortable and complicate marketing. So those questions are trimmed. This inscription shows a simple truth. Monuments were tools of power. When modern storytellers smooth that fact away, they are not neutral. They are choosing a version of history that suits patrons. Read the stone. It still tells who was meant to listen and why. Ancient trade networks. You are on the deck of a ship that never made port. The hull lies broken on a seafloor, and its cargo tells a story in pieces of stone and metal. Copper ingots, jars painted in Aegean style, beads of lapis the color of deep sky, and amber that traveled from cold northern shores. The wreck is one line on a map of movement that runs from the Baltic to Afghanistan. The Uluburan ship carried roughly 10 tons of copper ingots and a pile of luxury goods. Those ingots point to Cyprus as a major source. The cargo also included Mycenaean pottery from Greece and ivory and scarabs from Egypt. That mix cannot be explained by local exchange. It is a snapshot of a global system 4,000 years old. Back on land, the tombs at coastal cities show the same pattern. Jewelry with lapis from Far East, carnelian beads traced to India, amber beads traced to northern forests. Pottery styles travel with ideas and crews. Ports like Kamos and Hala Sultan Tiki sit as hubs that connected craftsmen, merchants, and political elites. Why does this matter now? Some modern narratives make ancient communities look small and local to fit a tidy museum script or to soothe donor sensibilities. They imply that monuments and wealth were homegrown and isolated. The artifacts in the ground refuse that edit. They demand we see wealth as global, contested, and tied to control of resources like copper. The goods in the ground leave no doubt. Copper ingots, stacked like currency, tell us who controlled the metal. Lapis beads from Afghanistan and amber from the Baltic tell us traders crossed continents. Mycenaean pottery and Egyptian scarabs in the same tomb show networks that tied island ports to royal courts and workshops. Those connections created concentrated wealth. Control of copper from Cyprus bought exotic materials and political alliances. That wealth supported elites who commissioned tombs and monuments. It also shaped who got remembered and who did not. Now look at how the story is sold today. Some museum displays and donor-funded projects prefer to show islands and cities as isolated treasures. They offer tidy narratives about local craft and humble origins. That makes for comfortable marketing. It fits gift plaques and gala speeches. It helps sponsors tell a story they can brand. The archaeological record tells a different tale. Objects moved, money and resources moved, power moved. Erasing those roots makes the past look smaller and less contested. That erasure benefits interests that want neat heritage narratives. It makes it easier to sell cultural experiences without asking tangled questions about extraction, trade control, or historical inequality. Think about the Uluburan ship. The cargo ties together many polities. It shows not innocent exchange, but commercial webs that created winners and losers. When modern sponsors simplify that complexity, they also simplify responsibility. They remove the messy history of who profited from resources and trade. So the final simple takeaway from these tombs and wrecks is this. The past was global, messy, and tied to power. If a polished exhibit or wealthy backer tells you the story is local and tidy, ask for provenance. Ask who paid for the narrative. Museum of the Bible Dead Sea Scrolls scandal. In 2009, Hobby Lobby president Steve Green began acquiring a collection of 16 Dead Sea Scrolls for his Museum of the Bible, a sprawling institution in Washington that sought to provide an immersive experience with sacred texts. The museum opened in 2017, and not long after, doubts began to swirl about the authenticity of its Dead Sea Scrolls. 5 were confirmed to be fake. Then, a study commissioned by the museum reached an even more damning conclusion. None of the textual fragments in the Museum of the Bible's Dead Sea Scroll collection are authentic. A team of independent researchers compiled the report with funding from the museum. The investigation spanned 6 months and saw the contested scrolls undergo examination with a battery of advanced technologies, including 3-dimensional microscopes and scanning electron microscopes. Green sourced his Dead Sea Scrolls from a collection of fragments that appeared on the antiquities market after 2002. Several key pieces of evidence pointed investigators toward their conclusion. Genuine Dead Sea Scrolls are made from tanned or lightly tanned parchment. The museum's pieces were written on leather, possibly sourced from ancient shoes or sandals. After 2,000 years, leather and parchment look very similar, until you do a high magnification analysis, as well as a chemical and elemental analysis. You really cannot tell the difference. The investigators also found shiny ink pools that ran off torn edges, suggesting the material was inked in modern times. Each of the 16 fragments exhibited characteristics that suggest they are deliberate forgeries created in the 20th century with the intent to mimic authentic Dead Sea Scroll fragments. Between 2009 and 2014, Green and Hobby Lobby spent a fortune buying up biblical manuscripts and artifacts. From 2009 to 2014, Green bought a total of 16 Dead Sea Scroll fragments in 4 batches. Initially, some Dead Sea Scroll experts thought the pieces were the real deal. Leading biblical scholars published a book on the Museum of the Bible's fragments, dating them to the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But the scholars were duped by modern forgeries. This is not the first time that Hobby Lobby has been embroiled in an antiquities scandal. In 2018, the arts and crafts chain returned 4,000 artifacts, among them cuneiform tablets, to Iraq after the United States Department of Justice filed a complaint alleging the objects had been smuggled into the country. The company agreed to return the artifacts and forfeit $3 million. Hobby Lobby was negligent in failing to conduct due diligence on scroll purchases it made over the course of 5 years. Only after the fragments were published and put on display did Museum of the Bible begin to study their authenticity in depth. By this time, Hobby Lobby had donated them to the museum, and the Green family had likely received their tax break for their donation. The government was effectively paying the Greens to amass a collection of dubious antiquities. Collectors and museums jumped at the chance to own the oldest known biblical texts. Since the new artifacts appeared on the market, institutions and private collectors have spent somewhere between $35 million and $45 million to purchase them. All those fragments, considered suspect for years, are now definitively called into question. The forgers likely used ancient scraps, possibly from archaeological sites around the Qumran caves. But most of the fake fragments are leather, not parchment, like the rest of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The leather scraps could have been bits from ancient Roman shoes. To make convincing forgeries, the forgers coated the scraps with a shiny amber material, most likely animal glue, to fix tears and match the waxy sheen of authentic Dead Sea Scroll fragments. Remarkably, despite being bought from 4 different sellers, all were coated by the same amber material, suggesting the forgeries may have come from the same hand. The news of the forgeries is a significant embarrassment for the museum, which, at 430,000 square feet in the heart of downtown Washington, is a deep investment for its evangelical founders. Museum leaders portrayed the fiasco as good for museums and the antiquities market. But this is not the first domino. Some scholars estimate that as many as 70 forged fragments, purportedly part of the Dead Sea Scrolls, have hit the market since 2002. The Parthenon marbles. The sculptures on show in the British Museum are remnants of a carved stone frieze that ran around the outside of the Parthenon temple on the Acropolis. The Parthenon marbles were removed from the Acropolis in Athens by Lord Elgin between 1801 and 1805. He then shipped them to Britain to join the collections of the British Museum in 1816. The removal happened under Ottoman imperial rule, a mere 5 years before the creation of the modern Greek state. Today, the British Museum has 17 figures from the pediments, 15 high-relief panels, and 75 meters of the low-relief frieze which encircled the Parthenon. Lord Bruce Elgin, the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, acquired permission from Ottoman authorities to make casts and remove some of the sculptures. Over the next 11 years, Elgin removed around half of the Parthenon's best sculptures and transported them to England. Elgin claimed he had a decree from the Sultan allowing him to remove them. This document's authenticity and scope have been debated for centuries, with critics arguing he exceeded any alleged permission. The poet Lord Byron famously criticized what Elgin had done, likening his actions to vandalism or looting. The House of Commons launched an investigation into the legality of transporting the marbles. A British parliamentary inquiry in 1816 concluded that Elgin had acquired the marbles legally. Elgin sold them to the British government in that year, after which they passed into the trusteeship of the British Museum. No official record of the decree has been found in the Turkish archives. The original document was still in Athens in 1810 and was probably destroyed during the outbreak of the Greek Revolution in 1821. The Greek government has been asking for the return of the Parthenon marbles since its independence in 1835. For Greece, these are not just art objects. They are an integral part of their national identity and heritage. The Greek government has consistently and passionately demanded their return, especially since the opening of the State-of-the-Art Acropolis Museum in 2009, specifically designed with a space awaiting the marbles' return. They argue that the marbles were illegally plundered, belong in their original context, and are crucial for understanding the Parthenon as a unified architectural and artistic masterpiece. The British Museum maintains that Elgin acquired the marbles legally under the prevailing laws of the time, and that they are best preserved and displayed for a global audience in London. The British Museum has argued that their return would set a precedent which could undermine the collections of the major museums of world culture. Museums do not traditionally discuss their questionable acquisitions openly in order to avoid the embarrassing admission that they have been deceived and the shaking of public faith in museum expertise. There is also a fear of offending donors or lenders. Many museum educational programs and exhibitions worldwide adopt approaches that avoid dealing with a fundamental issue in archaeological practice, which pertains to the paramount importance of context and the scientific consequences of its destruction through the illicit trade of antiquities. The hesitation in promoting this sensitive topic may be due to the fact that many objects in major museum collections are often without documented history. When modern sponsors simplify the complexity of contested heritage, they also simplify responsibility. They remove the messy history of who profited from resources and trade. In 2018, images of water leaking into the Greek galleries at the British Museum was widely circulated across Greek media. The museum claims it is the most qualified caretaker of the marbles. International critics disagree. The British Museum has become something of a running joke internationally in recent years. The museum's reputation for being a bastion of colonialism, built on artifacts pillaged from countries subjected by the British Empire, is growing year on year. Calls for the return of treasures increased after it was revealed that thousands of items had been stolen from the British Museum. Some argue the museum's security cannot be trusted. If the museum does not change its policies, public opinion may go against the museum, especially in a time where there is a global push for repatriation. Great Pyramid Radio Wave Study. In 2018, physicists modeled how the Great Pyramid responds to radio waves. They found that at certain long wavelengths, roughly 200 to 600 meters, the shape can act like a resonant cavity. In simple terms, that means waves bounce and focus in particular spots. Under those conditions, energy concentrates in chambers like the King's Chamber and under the base. Think of a playground swing. Push at the right rhythm and the swing goes higher. The pyramid, when hit by radio waves of the right rhythm, concentrates energy the same way. That is a neat physical fact. It does not mean someone built the monument as a radio device. Researchers point out a key caution. The effect needs modern radio wavelengths and specific external signals. It needs measurement equipment and modern theory to notice. There is no evidence the builders tuned stones to trap those wavelengths. There are no ancient antennas or toolkits that suggest a radio technology. Still, the idea of the pyramid as an energy machine made for dramatic headlines. Wealthy promoters and some high-profile shows used the study to hint at mystical power and secret tech. That is where science and marketing split. The physics is real. The leap from resonance to ancient advanced engineering is not supported by the material record. At certain long wavelengths, roughly 200 to 600 meters, the shape acts like a resonant cavity. Waves meet and concentrate in the king's chamber and below the base. That is real physics. Scientists point out an important limit. The effect appears with modern radio wavelengths and under controlled conditions. It requires measurement equipment and theory to notice. There is no evidence ancient builders tuned the stones with radio in mind. That careful caution is where trouble began. Some high-profile shows and wealthy promoters turned a tentative scientific oddity into a certainty of lost advanced technology. Headlines read as if the pyramid was designed as an energy machine. Tours and exhibits leaned into the mystique. Sponsors loved the spectacle because it sells tickets, and donors like to attach their names to mystery. Who benefits from that leap? Producers, tour operators, and high-profile backers who convert tentative science into marketable legend. They package uncertainty as wonder and then monetize the result. Science shrugs and publishes caveats. Marketing harvests certainty. So what do we take away here? The pyramid can concentrate waves under special conditions. That is interesting and potentially useful for modern engineering ideas. It is not a lost power plant. When you hear a headline that feels too neat, ask one simple question. Does the ground hold that claim, or does the money?